Okay, let's start. Hello, everyone. I'm Yusilio, and I will be the moderator for this seminar. And welcome to the first session of Turbid Media, Fog, Froth, and Foam in the Age of Device by Esther Leslie. So I'm going to first read the description of the seminar. This course observes the prevalence and expansion of forms of fog, froth, and foam in our device-filled world and our languages. For example, in pollution and the urban atmospheres produced by particulate hovering in the air, in tear gases directed against protest, in streams and seas clogged with toxic foams and froth, results of chemically effluence and climate change in space-time foam, a new ether, and metaphorically in cloud and foggy computing, and speculative frothy financial markets, and constructions of the social as foam and as bubble in social theory. Foggy and foamy forms are turbid, a perceptible quality defined by Goethe as generative of virgins per se. Media too can be turbid. Turbid media is the name given by physicists to muddy water or particularly polluted air in which the particles of poisonous dust are so dense as to be visible. This project explores turbid media not from the perspective of the physicist measuring propagation of light and other optical properties for determined ends, but from the perspective of a viewer speculating on a moment of optical engagement in which particles float on the air or gathered atop a latte or lend a name to the pixel-based cultures. What matter and media are fog, froth, and foam. How do these forms remake our world in their light and through their productions? Esther Leslie is professor of political aesthetics at Birkbeck, University of London. Her interests lie in the poetics of science, imbrication, and imbrication of politics and technologies. Current work focuses on turbid media and the aesthetics of turbulence. Her book includes various studies and translation of Walter Benjamin's, as well as Hollywood Fatland, animation, critical theory, and the avant-garde by Verso in 2002. Synthetic World, Name, Art, and the Chemical Industry by Reaction in 2005. The Ehrlich's Thought Worms from the Wreckage in 2014, and Liquid Crystal, The Science and the Art of a Fluid Form in 2016, and finally, Deeper in the Pyramid in 2018. So now I'm going to pass the mic to Esther. The floors are yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So, hello, everybody. Welcome to this first session. I've not taught on with the New Center before, and I'm finding my feet and quite intimidated in some ways. I have people from all over the place, very high level and interesting thinkers. So I'm finding my way in. And in this first session, what I want to do is to outline some of the themes that we'll be talking about, but also just try to give you a sense of my method, my rather elusive and poetic and slightly punning way of doing things. So I've written a paper. I have some images to show. I'm happy to be interrupted, or at the end of the paper, then just we go into discussion backwards and forwards. I'm also intrigued to know if anybody wants to present in the coming weeks, would be fantastic, and maybe we can use the Google Doc to organize that and communicate with each other about those.
Excuse me, hi, Esther. I think some of our panelists are saying that it's very quiet, so maybe is it possible for you to be a little bit louder?
Yeah, or I wonder if I should put up the microphone. Um, Mordecai, it's very quiet apparently. Audio settings, let me see. Um, is this better? Does it sound louder at
Yes.
all? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Put that.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. I've got some images, some GIFs, and I prefer people to look at things rather than me. So maybe this helps. So let's see what happens when I share. Okay, I'm hoping you can all see that, which I'll get to in a moment. So this is a course, and I interpret course in a way like the way a river takes a course, a sort of wandering, and it's a wandering through themes of turbidity, turbid forms, as well as the turbidity in thinking. And this all relates to things I've been thinking about for a few years now, and want to pull into a book which is really making an argument about the turbidity of our times, device driven capitalism, liquid crystal capitalism, as productive of, dependent on, and thought through turbid forms. And the turbid forms that we'll be looking at over the next 4 weeks are fog and foam and froth, and then something around active matter, particular dust, animated dust, matter suspended in air. So today I want to focus though on fog, and to set away into my mode of thinking through ideas of fog. And what you will see very quickly is that my my thought and my language is always undergoing slippage. And for me, fog and fogginess is both a sort of description of words, of a kind of penumbra around words that allows one word poetically to slip into another, one concept to slip into another. Um, but it's also, fogginess is also a kind of object. What I want to look at is going to be necessary to talk about clouds, which some might argue have been very much thought about, and in some ways very overdone in theory. Um, Plenty of people have written, for example, about the cloud metaphor, the Google style cloud metaphor, a very airy image for something very tangible and solid and energy hungry storage system. And that has been thought about, but I can't in a way shake that off, because I think that image is the image that covers over or relates to or clouds my whole method here, in that I'm asking you to pass between these fleeting, ephemeral, almost insubstantial things, and a materiality and a solidity, or a more obvious materiality that grounds them, that produces them, and is productive in turn of so much else, of other types of clouds, clouds of dust, clouds of um, uh, toxic matter, and so on. We won't dwell too long in the clouds today, but I want to think about how a metaphor takes on a life. So from clouds to the cloud, and then seems to shape a world in its image through all sorts of fantasies. But I want to push that on to a more present form of computing, or at least the hyped form of computing, fog computing, which in some ways is already giving way to edge computing. But fog computing is something we're going to hang around with for a little while. So I want to start in the fog. And I want to talk, I often thought that I talk a lot about matter, and came from my sense of Marxism as a materialism, and therefore it was matter that drew me. But more and more recently, I've become interested in the notion of substance and the resonances that substance has. So substance, um, to make a pun already, can be used and abused, substance abusers. And in some ways, I abuse substance in stretching my thought around them. Substance can be essential, this is the substance of things, the most concentrated form, the most exemplary form. Substance can also be that which is at the core of something and not immediately accessible. So I want to think about substances, and in thinking about substances, I also think about method, or it's tied up with questions of method. So to introduce you to my thinking, I wrote my PhD on Walter Benjamin a long time ago. And then my work arced towards animation and cultural theory, animation in the traditional restricted sense, cell animation. This was prior to the widespread presence of computer generated animation, Pixar and Sony. This was really thinking about Disney and Warner. Um, but since then, I haven't left behind the notion of animation. And in fact, that in some ways is the thing that interests me most of all. But this is animation everywhere. And I think as we move on, particularly when we think about active matter in our final session, and think about contemporary modes of imaging, a lot of that is an imaging that is both trying to access something that is animated, the molecule, the atom in their activity, and it's producing forms of animation, scientific animation, in order to render those sub-perceptual things intelligible. And my whole work of the past period, since writing about liquid crystals, really is to say that animation and the quest for animation and the fantasy of animation is everywhere, is driving, is what defines, in a sense, is pixel or liquid crystal or device driven capitalism. But we'll come to that. So since writing about animation in the strict sense, I've been more and more interested in substances, in stuff with qualities. And I have thought through various objects over the past few years. And I mean thought through in a very literal way, in that I've thought about, I wrote a book, With Synthetic Worlds, about nature and art and the quest for chemical color, and the ways in which romantic theory was the precondition for the finding of synthetic color, on the basis of, as you see in the middle of this image here, a notion of the drive to self-formation of substances, of chemicals. So I began to think through organic and synthetic chemistry, then liquid crystals. Here we see a GIF animation of liquid crystal doing its stuff under polarized lenses, and thinking through the liquid crystal and making an argument that once the liquid crystal is identified in 1888, it begins to produce notions of thinking. It alters the conceptual space, but it also feeds into and out of capital as both a liquid and a crystal, or crystallizing force, flow and freeze, and so on. I might say more about that here, just to illuminate the kind of substances and to make an argument that I want to make about how the substance I think about produces the methodology of thinking. So there was also work with Melanie Jackson on milk and butter very recently, and clay and mud, digital clays, the digital clay jellyfish, some work we did on genetic modification, and touch screen glass. Uh, there's my particularly grubby one photographed just now. And ice, as another way of thinking about liquid crystallinity, in a more literal way, and dust and clouds and fogs and froths and foams. So in relation to all these, I've been interested in the ways in which a material suggests, through its own qualities and through its resonances, through its sort of emanations, in a sense, it suggests its own mode of approach and its own sort of theoretical unraveling and recomposition, as suggested for me by Goethe's notion of tender empiricism. All factuality is already theory, he says. Um, this could be taken in a particular way to mean that we should look closely, very closely, so closely, Goethe is saying, that we enter into the qualities of what we see, or we exchange its qualities of being seen for our own qualities of seeing. And we let its qualities pervade our theory and our thinking. Again, Goethe, the phenomenon are themselves the theory. I might call this approach an effort at material mimesis. And so, for example, to understand a liquid crystal is to explore it from the perspectives of liquidity, how it allows for flow, its own flow, but also the flow that cascades across liquid crystal screens, but how it also produces and accounts for and brings into being crystallinity. So in this form, this inherently dialectical and contradictory form, which was prior to its discovery and for a long time afterwards, could not be thought because it broke with the standard phases of matter being an intermediary form, how that contradiction produces contradiction in the world and out of itself. From the crystal point of view, liquid crystals in their crystallinity might freeze the world as image, or allow us to think and undertake social relations that are frozen, unfrozen, rigid, or mutable, and how flips from phase to phase propose new ways of engagement or participation, or new modes of subjection or becoming subject, socially and historically. Now, liquid crystals, to stay with them, really fascinate me, and I find them very much underknown, which was why I sort of wrote a book about them. But that doesn't probably get read that much. But it fascinates me that they are everywhere in us and outside us, but we tend not to recognize them or know them or know what they are. And they belong to a class of materials known as soft matter, along with these other subjects I'm talking about, along with foams, gels, aerosol, mists, granular materials, and all of those materials exhibit very complex behaviors, which is why I want to do this course on them, write a book about them. They all, in physical terms, have self-organization, self-assembly, very distinctive and capricious physics. They exist in the sort of intermediate scale, so between the atomic and the larger whole, and they're always soft in some way. So soft matter, which is very responsive to inputs. Many tiny fluctuations act on them to and they operate as systems, and these tiny fluctuations and small inputs decide the system's fate, and they move from symmetrical to disorderly states and back into more definite and patterned states. And it's their defect that are these sort of points or curves or surfaces at which the orientation of all their individual molecules shift rapidly and produce these patterns that are then seen so beautifully through the polarized microscope. These are things that can be used, I suppose, captured, controlled, or smoothed out in order for it to function as we know it, best of all, within our devices, our liquid crystal screens. They are in our screens, so we carry them in our pockets and bags, and we hold them, and we're looking at something produced by them now. But at the same time, they're in the slimy mess of your soap dish, and they're in snail trails, they're in clothes, in silk, and in synthetic materials, they're in viruses. We eat and drink them in bread and milk. They might be brought into foams and adhesives and detergent and cosmetics and artificial flavorings, but at the same time, they're also biological forms in blood and muscle, in DNA. So very varied entities in living bodies or glossing the world. These soft matters, I think, have been subject to more and more investigation by scientists, by physicists, and biologists. And I think this is one of the things that sustained my interest in them since writing the book, and this all sort of spills over into, I suppose, both questions that emerge out of AI, but also anything where there are questions of self-organization and self-assembly, and the sort of advanced systems of materials management in order to operationalize materials. So these would be some of the things we'll think about. And these are very responsive entities. They respond to inputs, to heat or light or electricity. I initially thought I was going to write about crystals when I was beginning to work on the research for the book that became Liquid Crystals. And what fascinated me with crystals was they were understood by romantics as having life, as meeting the conditions for a life form. But this became, under Ernst Haeckel's theorization and others, including the person who first discovered and worked with them, Otto Lehmann, these were really understood to be life forms, to be alive. Some still operate from that context. Anyway, they're probed and prodded for so-called interesting, novel, complex behaviors, and often there's a sense in which these behaviors are very quickly understood through metaphors. So you will read the latest scientific information and experiments. People will say this liquid crystal sunset yellow dye, which you put on nachos, commercial nachos, um, dries into something under certain conditions that looks like a volcano that has emitted its gases, or chiral liquid crystals, which, you know, organize themselves in certain ways, look like swarms of birds. Um, so more recent work has been done on skyrmions, large clusters of these quasi particles as well, um, which are seen to be like schools of fish, and you can operationalize these movements to produce, say, camera lenses at the nano scale, like a zoom lens out of these materials at the smallest scales. So everything's metaphor, and frequently everything has a kind of lifelikeness around them. But I'll leave liquid crystals now and start to think about the matter, um, and substances in our world that I want to focus on, and thinking about it as well in terms of how it, you can't isolate it as a substance. It both can't be isolated from the way we think about it, so that entwinement of the phenomenon with the theory, um, but you also can't isolate it from its environments. These are things that are responsive to inputs, or they are things that give up much of themselves into the environment. Many people these days think a lot about environments, environmentality, about toxicity, about uh, changing the environment, and about substances within environments and their effect, um, on us and on nature and elsewise. I've always been drawn to think about those environments through history. And this is something that comes to me from, I suppose, Frankfurt School thinking, which stands by a historicity of nature, that which appears to be natural is subject to historical change and historical becoming. Um, and so we can think about, you know, a notion sort of through Lukács and others, maybe something called second nature, which is why I became so interested in synthetic chemistry and what happens when you can produce synthetic indigo, which is itself a historical requirement for a Germany that felt itself to not have enough empires in which, or enough of empire in which they could grow indigo and harvest it. So they had to produce it in a laboratory outside Berlin. Um, so in that sense, it emerges out of history. But then once you have synthetic dyes, or synthetic liquid crystals, that itself produces or constellates around it all sorts of historical shift. At the same time, though, I mean, second nature seems a little underwhelming for us now, and we talk much more about third nature, nature built from the bottom up by highly capitalized structures, and some talk about things like the Pfizer BioNTech vaccines as manifestations of third nature, with their genetic material built piece by piece by machine. And that may be something we want to come back to. But when I began, I said how clouds are a starting point here, that clouds lead you to fog sooner or later. And clouds keep returning in my thoughts. And I want to ask, what do clouds offer of themselves for thinking through themselves and through their arrangements, or what Thomas Howard, the namer of clouds, called their modifications. And what sort of clouds are we talking about? The clouds and their cognates, fog and mist, to roll in and bring with themselves a flurry of ideas, of fuzziness and obscuring, um, of naturalized forms, of something that's mobile, hard to capture, all of which as qualities are supposed to be transferred to the high-tech world of cloud computing and fogging networks. So is the cloud pervading my thoughts and my mode of thinking? Are the things I look at, all of them, these fogs, these froths, these foams, are they clouds of a thought, of a sort, a kind of nameable thing that turns easily to metaphor, that has itself as an area, a surface, and a depth, but is always remaking itself, always dissipating at the edges, redefining, dispelling, moving away from itself, indeed, shifting. So this central object, in a way, is defined by the fact that it is always unbecoming or becoming something else, and hence its uses for metaphorical thinking. So for quite a few years, I've been musing on vague entities, which rather than being things are more like qualities. They're very vague things, these soft matters, these clouds, fogs and froths and foams. Indeterminate entities, all of them in some way gas, suffused with particulates or gases trapped in bubbles, sometimes pliable and sometimes breakable or solid, sometimes produced by agitation or fermentation. So these airy suspensions, I saw them more and more once I became attuned to them. For example, in frothy coffees, making of which hisses from every cafe, beginning to hiss again now in London. Life is starting to return a little bit to social normality. Um, I see clouds in high definition images from telescopes of distant nebulae. I, like many others, went back to think about the cloud through history from a very airy, fairy existence, watery, watercolor existence in Constable's watercolors of cloud formations that he painted a mile or so up the road from where I am in Hampstead in the 1820s. A little later, John Ruskin talked about the storm cloud of the 19th century, and he claimed to see a new cloud phenomenon that had come into being partially through the factory pollution of Manchester, but partially for Ruskin also through the moral pestilence of people who were going along or involved in some way in capitalism. So it's sort of a historical moral cloud formation that he claims to see in the sky. And I looked at how clouds had been used in animations, how they had been drawn, um, and how it comes to be used in like every film studio in Hollywood in its logo uses clouds. I thought about the ways in which that was just a given, that film and its particular mode of social dreaming would have to draw us to the clouds. And I thought about tear gas as a cloud, and of course the cloud, the Google cloud, that physically robust, energy hungry data infrastructure whose self-representation um, is often cloudy, includes clouds around its data centers. So the first question I was asking myself was, what is a cloud, which eventually became unanswerable because it became the question, what is not a cloud? And I thought about how when clouds, um, the etymology and origin of the word cloud is meant to come from the word clod, which means a mass of rock or ball of hardened earth. People were thinking about those classic cumulus clouds. This one I'm showing here, caught at Mornington Crescent a couple of days ago, is a little like a cumulus cloud, but not a perfect one, not the one we get in emojis and so on. They thought they looked like clumps of petrified matter rather than something airy, so they named it after a lump of mud. Um, and that name, clod, then goes on to be attributed to a dull thinker, or plot, or plot, someone who stumbles around unthinkingly in a fog. I thought about the ways Ernst Bloch gives a very beautiful image of the kind of contradictory nature of the cloud in relation to utopian thinking in his study of the utopian function of art and literature, where clouds become a fairy tale quality of nature. Children think they're distant mountains, so really solid, these entities in a towering and wonderful foreign land above our heads, or a Switzerland in the sky. And he also thinks about it, and again it's this tendency always to metaphor around these things. He thinks about it as a castle or a mountain of ice for the fairy tale gaze, but also an island in the sea of heaven, or a ship, and the blue skies on which it sails resemble the ocean. So the the sky becomes the sea. There's this kind of reversal, and he carries that through politically. So that up there, the heavens, Himmel, the sky, is like a mirror reflecting the earth's inversion. And if down here below is the world of body and action, up there is the world of mind and thought and imagination, but also an alternate history, another history, a better one that could come down to earth. This is the impulse for our utopian thinking. So these clouds become a kind of screen for a revolutionary not yet, the, the to be filled with the contents of an unbounded anticipatory consciousness. This, of course, all becomes completely banalized in the management commercial sphere as blue sky thinking. Um, I wanted to just show you something from that early apprehension of the clouds as something to know, as something to be named and brought into thinking. I mentioned John Constable, the painter, making his watercolor studies of clouds day after day from direct observation on Hampstead Heath. And he had been reading work on clouds, not Luke Howard, but someone communicating Luke Howard's ideas, Thomas Foster, researching atmosphere. And this was a passage that Constable underlined in his own copy of his book. And he wrote things in the margins, and he held it with him as he painted the clouds and the rain from those clouds. Uh, Made his words damp, and you see the traces of the rain from those days on Hampstead Heath. So this passage particularly interested him, and he highlighted it. The atmosphere and its phenomena are everywhere, and thunder rolls and rainbows glitter in all conceivable situations, and we may view them, whether it may be our lot to dwell in the frozen countries of polar ice, in the mild climates of the temperate zone, or in the parched regions which lay more immediately under the path of the sun. Now, Constable rarely left the southeastern corner of England, but he makes the claim that Hampstead Heath is under the same sky and the same clouds as the entire world, and experience can be universal. And yet, to stand under the same skies and watch as if we were watching a film that is everywhere the same is one thing. To be exposed to the elements under the clouds in different climates, in different histories, or different historical moments, in different economies is another. The cloud, something that is one thing and also not what it seems to be, or a name for something that's always dissipating, or a metaphor for something else. Who would think these were objects without surfaces, strangely insubstantial, gaseous, just from looking at them? How could earthy solidity or cake icing pearls be its opposite, a gas and air? Not much. Michel Serres called clouds primary masses without qualities, and yet they're so forcefully upon us, mentally and physically too, as anyone who's suffered turbulence caused by clouds, uneven updrafting of warm air when you're flying in an aeroplane will know. But we seem to fall back on the soft cloud, letting us cushion us in some way to make us happy or soften the blows of life, support us, give way to us. Plenty of commercial items can attest to that. I'm drawn to this softness, even if the kitsch of its commercial variety repels me. It's an antidote in damaged and distorted form for damage and distortion. Walter Benjamin wrote in his essay from 1933, Experience and Poverty, about Mickey Mouse as an earth encircling figure of the collective dream, who, in an antidote to the creeping role of technology, can conjure miracles from his body, from his supporters and persecutors, and out of the most ordinary pieces of furniture, as well as from trees, clouds, and the sea. The Mickey Mouse, says Benjamin, came to save the world from the ahuman technological catastrophe of war. And on the battlefields of the Great War, chemical gases fuzzed up the European landscape, expelling through toxic heavy air the possibility of aura, of contemplation at peace, another kind of fog. That gas, those tear gases and mustard gases, made people, soldiers, cry, or worse, went into their lungs. Negated vision made people run, act without being able to contemplate. It's not a landscape of contemplation. Benjamin announces that the gas warfare of the First World War, together with technological reproduction, abolishes aura, for it destroys the landscape as a place of contemplation. And yet, at the same time, something like aura, this phony aura that he talks of, this phony synthetic cloud, is produced and reproduced, and aura after aura, aura produced technologically but presenting itself as a new fate or a new natural order. Um, Elsewhere in his essay, where he talks about Mickey Mouse coming magically to comfort us as a figure of the collective dream, Benjamin talks about his own fin de siècle generation, a generation that had gone to school on a horse-drawn streetcar, now stood under the open sky in a countryside in which nothing remained unchanged but the clouds. And beneath these clouds, in a field of force of destructive torrents and explosions, was the tiny, fragile human body. A body that's no less fragile now, but I think the force fields and the torrents have gained different resonances, as have the clouds, which can no longer be claimed as unchanged. And if you look up the word cloud on an internet search engine now, the references that dominate are to the cloud, the computer infrastructure or or storage space for bits of data which manifest as pixels. Such information clouds are made of parts. The cloud is not imagined in the internet zones that are themselves of cloud as fluffy ball-like structures, but rather as something indistinct, perhaps as universal, apparently, in its coverage, as Constable's cloud-filled skies. But this cloud computing, despite its use of the cumulus cloud icon, is more like an overcast sky, pervasive, unseen, the white sheet that Constable spoke of, or a greyish sheet, but it tends towards invisibility. Now, thinking about the cloud led me to the fog because it kind of encompasses you as you think about it and you find yourself in a fog. And not just London fog, which is famous, or any other urban particular, but the particulate in general, the fog of pollution, of bad air, of atmospheric gases suffused with particles of dust. Fog is cloud come down to earth, visible aerosol, dense concentration of molecules suspended in air. And I'm talking, when I talk of fog computing, about a new fog, the fog of the 21st century, this blurry, all-encompassing atmosphere in which nothing can be seen or mapped or communicated for us, but only for us and for others. So fog computing may, in some ways, in that exchange of vision, we don't see it, we don't apprehend it, it's there, but we don't see it. It gives its fog-like qualities to us, but our devices see or are super sensitive or responsive to inputs. It's an intelligent fog, typed, I suppose, in a way like as if it were some new primordial froth that first cooked up the amino acids that eventually became human. Fog computing is tied up with the Internet of Things, which sets objects in communication with each other, um, producing networks and smart grids or fogging networks, um, through which computing power, storage of data, applications all come into being. And it is the cloud brought down to earth in the sense that all this processing power and storage power is brought closer to the location where data is gathered, held near, not pushed away into further off cloud centers, but surrounds us. In this kind of slippage between thing and world or representation. I find it fascinating that, you know, one of the first fog computing systems or manufacturers that I became aware of was Cisco Systems in San Francisco, which, you know, of course is famous for its fog. So it's like this new fog made in the place where the old fog still plagues us. These metaphors of fog take off and they roll in like clouds and haze, and they remake language and imagination, and a fog that was once meteorological is now also technical. If we think about mapping our world, about cognitive mapping or getting our bearings within the fog, there's a certain kind of precision that's now possible and absolute, at least for our devices, which always stand at a triangulation of forces. Our locations, as we know, forever monitored, not just by us, but by all sorts of parties interested in our movements and actions and purchases and thoughts and emotions, and all that sometimes remains quite foggy even to ourselves. But we are very found in the fog of computers. Um, which know better than we do where we are and who we are by the particles of self that have been shed from us in our movements that are logged and forever archived like a precious dust. At the same time, if we want to think through contradiction, we might argue that we've never been more lost or more unaware of what also occupies our space or trembles the atoms around us or disturbs us, what turbulence is happening in our vicinity, which we cannot see, but which suffuses our atmosphere. Um, how can we bring that fog, all of that activity, all of that um, movement, turbid movement into vision? So now I start to talk about a politics of atmosphere, aerial politics, which also concerns engineering. I think about inflatables in this regard, these kind of literal cloud buildings that appeared all hopefully and happily in the 1960s and 70s, buildings that have clouds of gas within them, but which were the inheritors of a longer history of hot air balloons and other modes which have moved between military application, state aggrandizing functions, and avant garde utopian obsession. One location of some of this work was the 1970 Art Expo in Osaka, Japan, where the Fuji Group Pavilion was the largest air inflated structure in the world at the time. And inside this structure of compressed air and plastic, the first IMAX screen was debuted. So the structure of air continuously enfolding on itself, responding to every wind gust or shift in atmosphere was one thing, but also in the exhibit was the Pepsi Cola pavilion. Um, yeah, I got so nervous about copyright warnings. Was this was very under imaged for my talks, but I hope I could get away with this because it's commercial. So the Pepsi pavilion, which was part of this expo, whose theme was progress and harmony in mankind, was designed by Robert Rauschenberg's global initiative EAT, Experiments in Art and Technology, and Robert Breer made some sculptures for the Pepsi structure, which were called floats, and they moved like clouds with little battery powered motors and little wheels, and they moved very, very gently. You could barely see them moving, and they gave off little sounds of birds singing, voices talking about a beautiful landscape for contemplation. But as they did this, the floats were immersed in an artificial fog. Um, and the artificial fog covered the whole of the Pepsi Cola pavilion. And it was generated by Fujiko Nakaya, an artist who still operates today, who still makes fog sculptures today. Her father is a fascinating figure. He created the first artificial snow crystal in 1936, as well as artificial fog at that time in the context of Japanese military research. And that fog system has an afterlife. An updated version is used as a means of air conditioning in data centers. So Facebook's data center in Oregano um, uses this artificial fog system. But Nakaya, daughter, was producing this as a kind of atmosphere, um, which feeds into all of, in a sense, for me, as an emblem of what is to come, a manifestation of the fog, artificial fogs that come to dominate and to become part of the material infrastructures that sustain surveillance capitalism, prediction of behaviors from consumption to pre-crime, and so on. So I'm addressing fog here as a kind of metaphor for being lost in the world, but then that very property of fog as confusing can become operative. I mean, fog, artificial fog, is used as smoke screens. That's what Nakaya father was working on, producing fog so that enemy planes could lose their bearings pre radar and get lost and so on. So fog is militarized, linked into a science and a technology of environment serving military ends. And then, you know, it becomes available in certain ways for sort of metaphorical applications that redouble on these previous applications. But I'm also, I mean, part of this actuality of fog, this atmospheric fog, is also subject to historical shift, um, especially if we think about it in relation to being suffused with particles of dust, becoming another kind of material fog, that not necessarily produced deliberately, but is produced as a kind of byproduct of our modes of living. Um, I've been thinking about these sort of pollutant fogs, particulates, thick particulars, again back to that London fog, which was a natural technical kind of object. And thinking about those within a longer kind of span. I was reading a passage from Michael Faraday, the 19th century chemist and physicist, who described watching sand being cast by an experimenter from a hot air balloon um, into the glittering light of a late evening in London in 1850. And he writes this: ballast was thrown out 2 or 3 times, and it was probably sand, for the dust of it had this effect, that a stream of golden cloud seemed to descend from the balloon, shooting downwards for a moment, and then remained apparently stationary, the balloon and it separating very slowly. It shows the wonderful manner in which each particle of this dusty cloud must have made its impression on the eye by the light reflected from it, and is a fine illustration of the combination of many effects, each utterly insensible alone, into one sum of fine effect. If a cloud of dusty matter, as powdered chalk or road dust, were purposely poured forth under these circumstances, it would give a fine effect both to those on earth and those in the balloon. So he's thinking, 100 70 years ago about sand, or chalk or dust within light and air, these banal elements coexisting and then becoming in their combination in a particular moment something extraordinary. Each turbid particle, each tiny part of a twinkling fog making a mark on the eye, and what was insensible, inert, or lifeless becomes remarkable or an amplification of life through an aesthetic sense of attention. I want to think about the way in which a particulate then becomes particular. And I want to think about what this as a vignette might make us think about the ideas of media, a medium, or the coming together here of media and medium. So, for the hot air balloon, the medium is air, and something, passes through it. But from a scientific point of view, um, um, media would be the interference, that which you can sort of see within the air. And I suppose also for sand, from an artistic point of view, the material of which the artwork consists, if we call it an artwork, is sand. So that's the medium. The hot air balloon is a medium from a technological point of view, because it's that which is conveying the message that the sand is giving out. And then from a contemporary perspective, after McLuhan, light would be the medium. Michael Faraday writes of the wonderful manner in which each particle of this dusty cloud must have made its impression on the eye by the light reflected from it. A fine illustration of the combination of many effects into one sum of fine effect. And though he's speaking of science and technological development, he doesn't overlook his aesthetic relationship to the advances of industrial capitalism, which he helped bring into being through his work on electricity. So as when I was sort of looking into the ways in which the Romantics set off the synthetic dye industry in Germany, and liquid crystals emerged out of a highly aesthetically attuned notion of science. Now here too, there's something about the significance of the sensual in science producing, I suppose it's about these points of healing, the ruptures between science and technology on the one hand, and aesthetics and the sensuous on the other hand. Again, is sort of taking me back to Goethe and the notion of tender empiricism, and the opening up of new kinds of sensual excitement, new kinds of beauty. So I've been writing this study of turbid media, which works around a pun. So the media being here not films and TV or podcasts or radio shows or whatever, but this complicated sort of notion of media that I might take from Faraday's image. Turbid media is the name given by physicists to muddy water or particularly polluted air in which particles of dust are so dense as to be visible. The foggy and foamy forms are turbid. Turbidity, the turbid or trübe, is the quality defined by Goethe as generative of vision per se. So without turbidity, there is nothing to see. He writes his color theory book, and it's all about color and light. And then there comes a point when he says, no, it's not about color and light. It's about the turbidity of the medium. Those are the conditions of seeing. And I'm making the argument and overextending things, as is my procedure, that turbidity is the condition of vision that surrounds us. So rather than something which we look at or through in order to see another thing or representation, turbidity is the thing I want to focus on itself, or to bring it into vision where it is not visible. So I began to ask about the forceful presence in our world in various ways, both actually and metaphorically, of turbid forms, of fogs and foams and froth, some caused by pollution, some by the agitations of our busy earth and the needs we develop to match the world's pace, like frothy coffee everywhere. Animations at the heart of this, in the sense that turbid forms often come into representation for scientific purposes through animation. But a turbid form is itself animated, it has energy in every particle. When the air is thick with particulate and is coughed out of the back of a car's exhaust, the particles dance in the sunlight, just like Faraday's dust. I'm not going to talk about clouds of dust now, although I might come back to those in relation to active matter. I'm particularly interested in the work of John Gerard and his animation of Gulf War and Dust Bowl dust, which might give us a hint to the sense in which dust might be a kind of a war, a landscape whipped up into a weapon. But as we're sort of, coming towards the home straight, I wanted to bring in the moment of our benighted existence and the clouds and the fogs that we pass through now, in particular the aerosols of virus or invisible clouds that threaten to contaminate us and crowd the atmosphere and compel us at points to remain inside, spending all the more time with their virtual namesakes, the online cloud. Respiratory coronaviruses such as SARS-CoV-2 are a soft matter form transmitted by another soft matter object, aerosols, in which the liquid phase is rich in mucin and other biopolymers. So the pandemic that we are living through now is a cloud, is part of what a cloud is and does. A recent article on soft matter science and the COVID-19 pandemic put it like this. Get beyond my easy animation. Importantly, it's not so much the single body motion of isolated droplets, but the collective motion of a propelled turbulent cloud of droplets that controls subsequent travel through air and deposition on surfaces. Everything's a cloud. What is not a cloud if we choose to see it that way? This is a new building going up just outside my window. It's very large. If we think about atmosphere, because in a way, I suppose I'm arguing that this cloud and this fog and this meteorological existence it sort of becomes atmosphere, and if something becomes atmosphere, it becomes intangible but very effective work upon you. So I just want to dwell with atmosphere for a moment. Recent atmospheric studies over the eastern North Atlantic have observed that tiny aerosol particles that seed the forming of clouds can appear from almost nothing when above oceans. From a few atoms of gas clustered in the boundary layer between the sea and the air, that is to say the atmosphere that exists up to a kilometre above the surface of the Earth, feeding particles for clouds are formed. And sunlight reacts with the molecules of trace gases, and water condenses on these particles as cloud droplets. So this tininess, this minuscularity, this particularity scales up to affect and makes whole atmospheres. So we see an atmosphere sort of generated from this interaction between sea and air and trace gases, and then produces whole weather systems out of itself. This is new knowledge about cloud formations not available to Luke Howard or Thomas Forster or John Constable or anyone. It's the sort of production of kind of instant particles that kind of flash into being is very helpful, apparently, to those who wish to build simulations of the climate of the Earth historically from the past and also speculatively into the future. These are models that draw on the other clouds' power of rapid calculation and its play with the particularities of different aerosol properties, different sizes, number, and spatial distribution. These multiple calculations as to how each tiny aerosol particle and the clouds they form will reflect and absorb sunlight and affect the temperature on Earth. So crucial knowledge for modeling climate change. Since 2019, we have all been able to toggle an animated layer of clouds, the last 24 hours of cloud data on and off at any point on the globe through Google Earth. So that cloud facilitates clouds or past clouds as experience, composited, not photographed. So they're second order pixel clouds at an animation rate of 1 frame per second, corresponding to 1 hour of cloud motion time per second in Google Earth, with smooth blending or cross-fading between successive frames of the video. Now, are those clouds for gazing on, or are they there because they can be? It's a technical capacity we have, so let's do it. Or are they a gesture towards those clouds that promised a universal experience and hinted at democratic existence for Constable? And what about how they come to be and how they exist in their specific rendition of the world? What about that would help us to understand them better? What tender empirical gaze would be the revealing gaze for those clouds? I've spoken a lot about or suggested the ways in which the cloud, what emanates out of this Google building on my screen and all of the platform capitalism institutions that are around it in the new King's Cross in London, you know, very much institutions of surveillance capitalism in many ways. And I've gestured towards that, and I want to gesture towards a kind of lesson by evoking another type of cloud, which also has a long history, which is the ether cloud. Um, I was thinking about ether when I was walking through London, centre of London, and then found out later by something that came on the online news flow that I had been unknowingly participating in a police trial, scanning the faces of everyone who passed a certain point in London and matching them to existing databases of people, you know, who are wanted in some way, who have already been logged as known. It's a branch of computing that was being used known as face hallucination, which converts very noisy, low resolution, blurry or foggy facial images into high resolution images on the basis of inputted knowledge about typical facial features as a standardization technique and a prediction technique on the basis of that, whereby fogginess is resolved computationally. The mechanical ghosts of the algorithmic world never stop communicating through their new ethers with omniscient databases that technologists claim can predict the future. And I sort of set this, I suppose, in relation to another scientist, you know, proper 19th century scientist who developed radio technology, or one of the components, crucial components of radio technology, who operated from the presumption that there's something called ether, which is in the air. Now, you know, well, some scientists have come back round to a kind of notion of ether, but it was a discredited notion. The scientist Oliver Lodge also believed he could communicate with his son, who'd been killed on the battlefield of World War One, through this ether, that it was a medium of communication and transmission. And this is why early radio was called an ether medium. Ether for us today probably has more resonances of from the idea of the open source blockchain based computational platform called Ethereum, a currency that's able to inflate, able, unlike Bitcoin, to swell on the wind of transactions. So it's a medium of exchange, which is reliant on a cloud architecture, its unit of computation being gas, mist being the name of the browser. Although the work of adding transactions to the ledger, to the blockchain is of course called mining, evoking something more solid, material, muddy, tough, and tangible. And these things, of course, are coming more into visibility in relation to the art world through these non-fungible tokens, crypto collectibles, unique tradable tokens, which are names for a sort of perverse set of affairs from a Benjaminian point of view, for art forms that are locked yet again to an aura, a manufactured aura of non-reproducibility, a matchless virtuality trapped within a network code. Now, that new digital ether might be less of a wind and more of a bubble, which bursts as economic schemes are wont to do. And if aura was a haze that impressed, in a literal sense, or imprinted the social world of the cushioned bourgeoisie into early photography, or onto early photography, if it finds new forms now, and something like this person does not exist, which always has blurry backgrounds. I see a kind of parallel between this AI generated face and this first photograph of the self with its blur around it, which Benjamin reads as an aura that is both technologically conditioned, because the lenses were slow and they couldn't, papers or the plates couldn't deal with light, but he also sees it as socially conditioned because this is the fantasy of their autonomy within an imperialist world on the part of the bourgeoisie who are representing themselves. Perhaps we could say, you know, through several twists of words, that the bubble's the most appropriate emblem of our social world in certain ways, and it's bubbles that are contained in foam and froth is not so much in fog. So we will come back to bubbles. I thought about talking about photography because I promised that, but I think I want to leave that now. I might come back to that another time because I think it is more, perhaps it's more to do with issues of active matter and the ways in which we conceptualize or can overcome gravity through the CGI image, or how we interact with gravity in certain ways. So let me just go to a conclusion before we all open up. Our epoch has penetrated to the heart of things. We've gone through the fog, although in some ways, in going through the fog, all we get to see is the fog. I'm really interested in these more recent photographs, which take images at the atomic and molecular scale. From a quantum perspective, there are no longer things, only processes, objects in relation, objects always in motion. Things themselves are always a blur of unthingness, a fog of activity, chaotic movement, constant change. Something like a turbid medium, or at least our imaging technologies, in as much as we access that which was previously inaccessible, can only show them to us in relation to this fog, to this turbidity. There's no thing, there's only mediums or media in which liquid mergings take place, moments cohere or coalesce, poses flash by, signals are sent and received, sometimes long, long after. So science and technology and imaging combined to bring out fuzzy and then sharper images of things unseen. So this here is pentastene molecule. And there are continuous efforts to photograph or image at the atomic scale to capture atoms in all their presence as if they could be tiny solid balls. So to see our building blocks and bring it into the realm of image, even if just as a blurry grey emanation from an electron microscope. This is these images at the molecular scale are composited over many hours, days, weeks, months, and they're not visions. You know, they're what would we call it? They're like imprints in a sense. They're touched into being by the beams that scatter um, uh, impulses back from that which is below the realm of the perceptual, where there is no light, and so on. In 2018, there was a very celebrated image, apparently, of a laser illuminating a single strontium atom suspended in the air by two electrodes, so caught within a strong electrical field. And the two electrodes are 2 millimeters apart. When illuminated by a laser of the right blue-violet color, the atom absorbs and re-emits light particles sufficiently quickly to be captured in a long exposure from a camera that's been equipped with all sorts of encumbrances. The diameter of a strontium atom is a few millionths of a millimeter, but it expands beyond itself in the light or in the many light beams over time, which excite its orbiting electrons and energize them so they give off light. But this, in a sense, is so many atoms having been reflected upon. Think about that in relation to Faraday and the dust and each particle sort of reflecting the sun. This is that sort of, but squashed into a single image, which bleeds out as a type of confusion, an impression presented as fact called a single trapped atom, as if we could trap an atom, or as if it's the atom that we're seeing rather than everything that surrounds it and the light reflected off many iterations of atom, which as a thing is not a thing, it's a quality, is ambivalent, as we know, between dot and wave, fixed point, fluid, squid, skid, is impermanent movement, impossible to observe without changing it, is part of a melee, a crowd, a turbulent, turbid buzz. Each atom, though, for us now is to be imagined as a floating bubble, captured or rescued from its fog of agitation and held. Still, for really what we see as a non-ontological being, aestheticized, operationalized, and mediatized. I think you can see from my method, in a way, everything becomes fog or is brought into vision from out of the fog or falls back into the fog or gets surrounded by a kind of fog of thoughts and thinking. But for me, I'm trying to argue that fog becomes a name for a way of seeing and also not seeing, and also sort of seeing into what cannot be seen, or it marks a kind of space of trying to bring things out or trying to push them away. And for me, it, like all the objects or substances I choose to think through, it contains contradictions at the heart of itself, but also at the heart of the mode of thought that it allows to come into being. And I will sort of continue this kind of mode of examination, and maybe more concretely or through works of art or things that we can, you know, talk about together, um, perhaps more easily than some of these elements, but we'll look at that in relation to foam and froth and active matter and other types of turbidity. And I really hope you have examples and you want to introduce them and present around them, and so you don't have to listen to me talking for a very long time. So I'll stop sharing my screen and let's just open up into discussion, questions. If you want to use the chat, if you want to speak live, so to speak, please do that. Questions, comments, criticisms, points of clarification, everything very, very welcome. So stop sharing. Thank you. If anyone wants to get up and get a glass of water or anything, please do.
Could I just ask what the, let's say, lowest common denominator for all these things you're calling media would be, because it doesn't seem to be anything necessarily technological. Yeah, just a basic question. Maybe if you could elaborate a bit on this. Thank you.
I think it's, I think that on the one hand, it is pulling the different things together. So thinking about the hot air balloon, thinking, well, yeah, it is it just that kind of, you know, atmosphere? Is it air, you know, through which sound waves and light waves pass, or are we talking about it in an artistic sense as a kind of medium, that which you make your art from, or are we? And I think the lowest common denominator for me probably comes from the notion of turbid media, which relates to Goethe's notion of the turbid. And so it's kind of an interference, something which is perceptible as interference. That might be the lowest common denominator, in the sense that that covers you know, polluted air. You know, you can see the particulate within it, or you can't see it, but you can measure it with scientific instruments. But at the same time, it also, you know, would relate to the ways in which we can record the interference movements at the atomic scale through our devices. So yeah, I think it's it's probably a point of interference into environment, however those are defined, which then can also cover a radio show or a film or something. I mean, that's also a kind of point of interference. But I think it's also part of what is being explored here then. What does it mean to talk about media? If you know, physicists have a notion of media, but it doesn't seem to be the same as a media studies person or an artist talking about a medium. Or, you know, there's been lots of stuff, hasn't there, in all that work on atmospheres, about atmosphere as a kind of media, in that it's conveying messages or producing effect without us necessarily being aware of it. So there are sort of extensions as to what we mean by media. But yeah, I mean, good question. I think partly that's sort of what we might think about, what would be that lowest common denominator. And maybe there isn't, maybe it's all just my mad method of drawing things together. Yeah, anyone else want to or ask questions or comments? Is anyone thinking they might like to present something, or thinking about what, you know, what you would like to talk about in relation to these themes?
Hi.
Yeah.
It's not so much of a specific question, but you mentioned this association between a romantic imagination and, for example, the invention of dyes. And this is an intersection that interests me a lot. And I was wondering if you could comment a little bit more on this cohabitation of a romantic imagination, early techniques of turbid media, for example.
Yeah. It's well, one of the reasons I wrote this book, Synthetic. Well, I mean, well, I was interested in, you know, Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, which tells this sort of history of I.G. Farben, and he has all these weird sort of occult and mystical figures who are sort of coming into this history of a dye factory or conglomeration of dye factories that becomes very tied up in the Nazi period and has slave labor camp at Auschwitz. And I was interested in that, and I wanted to sort of unravel the more conventional historical basis of that. So I was very much sent back, and partly because I'd written this book on animation, which had become really interested in color in animation, and through that I'd looked at the argument between Goethe and Newton. I mean, Newton is dead, but you know, his notion of color, very mathematically based, optically based, and then Goethe comes along and talks about, well, what happens if I poke my fingers in my eyes? That changes the way I see, and to produce a rainbow, it depends where I'm standing, and everything is contextual. So I was really interested in Goethe's mode of scientific approach, which is not strictly romantic, but it emerges alongside romantic natural philosophy, as does Hegel's mode of scientific investigation. Now, Hegel reports on things, unlike Kant, who makes scientific breakthroughs around weather systems and around seismology and earthquakes and so on. But Goethe also makes breakthroughs and discovers the intermaxillary bone and all sorts of things that are proto-evolutionary, ideas around botany, and he's very close to this figure called uh, Ferdinand Friedrich Runge, who is the person who discovers how to make synthetic indigo. So the first blue artificial blue dye in Germany, which he makes out of coal tar waste. He discovers it accidentally, and coal tar waste is, this horrible product that's starting to be more prevalent because Germany is beginning to mine coal and beginning its industrial revolution. And so in the 1820s, Runge makes this blue dye, and he's this person who's fascinated in the idea that, he comes from a romantic training. He had to defend his PhD in front of Hegel because everybody did who took a PhD in Germany, it seems, or at least in Berlin at that time. So he had to develop a dialectical understanding of what was happening, and part of that dialectics is to talk about the liveliness and self-determination within nature. So that fascinated me, and then seeing that, I sort of worked back from that to see just, Novalis, real name Friedrich von Hardenberg, Goethe himself. Many of the Romantic poets studied geology and mining at university because that was the really fashionable thing to do. And then at night they would write these wild stories about what happens in the mine. Um, and and so I think partly I think there's a concrete sort of relationship between the this sort of notion that was strong at the time, the dark side of nature or the night side of nature. There's a guy called Gottfried Schubert who wrote a book called the Night Side of Nature, about strange phenomena, all those things that fascinated the Romantics, and they write about in their stories and in their poetry. But they're also sort of practically digging into the earth and finding these hidden treasures. And as part of that, finding brown coal. Novalis, Friedrich von Hardenberg, discovers brown coal processing, which becomes absolutely key to the German Industrial Revolution and the production of synthetic dyes. So that I just find this really strange relationship between them, but also I think there's something about the mode of thinking within German natural philosophy of the time, which attributes to nature certain kinds of agency, which holds sort of the subjectivity of the human in relationship and in critical reflective relationship to the world and the things that are being studied, that makes possible, you can see it very concretely in Goethe and in Runge and in Novalis, makes very possible scientific discoveries. So it's not that you need that Newtonian method, or you need mathematics, or you need a certain kind of analysis, but the only effects of it outside of Germany are within the art world. So Goethe's theory of color is translated a bit later, but for art students, so it's never taken up as a scientific proposition, despite the fact that his sense of psychological colors, ephemeral and fugitive colors, contextual color, is all absolutely crucial. And then sometime later it gets used for the establishment of Polaroid and color TV and stuff. Edwin Land, who invented Polaroid, got really interested in it, but it's not accepted within the sort of outside of Germany. But yeah, I do think that's why I'm particularly interested, I think, in German romantics who haven't made that separation between the aesthetic and the scientific. So that's part of what's important there, I think. And so that's why I pick up on sort of Faraday and these moments when there is an aesthetic purpose, at least, to scientific experiment. What's your interest in that, if you want to say?
Well, I come from literary theory mostly, and I was thinking about, well, English romanticism as well, especially in Wordsworth, who has, right, the cloud as a kind of elected symbol for his kind of lyrical worldview or whatever. But yeah, so this is, I think we can keep this in the air for the following meetings, but thank you for the answer.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, anyone else got a comment or a point? Or you could write it in the, if you don't want to speak, just write it into the chat. Hi, Pedro. Anyone? I've just bamboozled you all into silence.
Hi, I'm not sure how much is it relevant, but recently I was reading Wilhelm Flusser, Vampirotoitis Internalis, and I was really inspired by Vampirotoitian art. So these are the sepia clouds that the animal is producing to. In fact, in more primitive species, it is produced to escape from the enemy, but Vampirotoitis, it doesn't have enemies. So in fact, his sepia clouds are used, like, are a form of dialogue between the other Vampirotoitis.
Really? Wow.
Yes, so I could paste this part in our chat. I thought
yes,
it was quite interesting.
Please, yeah, do. So what is it? Vampire? What is the animal?
It's vampire squid. I hope I pronounced it well.
Okay, no, that sounds really good. So then it actually, the cloud actually is a medium of communication then. I mean, do you know if they say different things with them?
They can somehow modulate. Like other squids, they just produce the cloud that takes the shape of the squid. But Vampirotoitus, it is able to make various shapes.
Wow.
So
I love it. And they're sepia, do you say? Sepia color.
sepia, so yes, probably.
Yeah. So it's like early photography was all sepia, wasn't it? No, it'd be really nice if you put that in the chat. So yeah, I don't know that, and that's yeah, very beautiful, and presumably this is sort of within water, I suppose. So it's a sort of medium within a medium, which is really interesting. Yeah, thank you. Would anyone like to say kind of what they're working on, or where they are, or yeah, just a sort of relationship to things? I wonder where we're all located. Um, I mean, does anyone, I mean, this whole sort of liquid crystal thing, which has so fascinated me for quite a while. I mean, I don't know, is this something you think about or are conscious of, or is it just a sort of, you know, banality in a way? Of course, you know, we all know about the liquid crystal. Or I'm still kind of wondering, you know, whether that's yeah, whether people know what they are or what they do, or you know, how we access them. I mean, you know, in some ways, these things. I mean, I talk about this epoch as a sort of liquid crystal epoch, or but you know, maybe things shift in terms of screen technologies and OLEDs and other sort of forms. In which case, I have to sort of revise my whole sense in which, you know, I kind of I make these substances or these forms determining in some way, you know, that it was significant. It wasn't plasma, which in many ways is much more foggy and aerated, you know, that wasn't the technology that took off. And there could be really banal reasons for that. We didn't want big TVs at that point, or they have shorter lives, or they're more expensive to produce. But yeah, it all sort of disappears. But this other thing remains for a certain period, and then it shifts. So there's this sense, you know, I wrestle with, and you know, what is necessary and what is arbitrary about these things that come to be our media and to compose our environment. And is it really plausible to sort of say there's more to it than it's just the technology that works? You know, something spills out from it, something spills into it and makes it possible to be made, to be thought, to be embraced in some way. I don't know. This is what I wrestle with.
So I'm curious if the LCD that you're talking about, if it's a sort of analogy or metaphor for a specific historical moment, right? And what would be the material properties in LCD that communicate with the kind of epochal characteristics of our, I don't know if it would be our time, you know, but what time would that be? Or if you want to unpack it a little bit, that'd be nice.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think so. I was interested. What made it possible for someone, you know, Otto Lehmann, to discover them in 1888 when, you know, they've always been around, you know, they're in our DNA, they case our nerves, you know. Of course, there comes a moment when he's able to carry out an experiment and observe that something has two melting points and phase changes and has a really curious middle phase in which it's both liquid and crystal in a sense at the same time. So for me, the question was, what made it possible for him to think that then? And at exactly the same moment when, for me, something like film and animation, which especially animation, you know, is a technology which relies on a certain kind of frozen cell image, you know, that's then sort of mobilized into life through its flow, through a certain kind of liquidity. It also sort of comes after a key painting for me, Caspar David Friedrich's painting which is called Ice Mare or Sea of Ice as another kind of liquid crystal, although, you know, this is a more literal one in that it's an ice, you know, ice can be liquid, ice can be crystal. The Ice Mare, which is the German name for polar sea. This ice sea is a painting of something imagined but very concrete, which relates to all sorts of ideas in Kant about trade winds and the free circulation of ships, which are part of a imperial and capitalist project around the world. Caspar David Friedrich's painting shows one that's been interrupted in its travels and smashed up by the ice that it accidentally steered into. So that painting for me becomes very significant in terms of thinking about a model of capitalism which wants there to be flow and movement and the globe conceptualized as one place, you know, comfortable sort of single environment in a way for a universal bourgeois subject, but at the same time nature impedes it. You know, nature puts a block. There are political borders. There's this constant tension that we still live within. I think that capital, in a sense, is about flow, and it's about the sort of management and disruption of that flow. And so I also looked at the ways in which Marx starts to think through ideas of congealment, which is an icing up of the heat of labor into the coldness of the commodity. And so, you know, there's lots of ways in which the 19th century makes it possible to think of contradictions such as liquidity and crystallinity, or the liquid crystal. And that's what Lehman does, but it's still as a scientific object, it's avant-garde. It goes against scientific doxa, and it takes 50 years for them to be used in Japan in the electronics industry for sort of early LCD watches that you're all probably too young to remember, but the first, you know, LCDs were these grey watches with a sort of little green illuminating liquid crystal within it. And then, you know, and that's like the 1960s, and then really rapidly the technology takes off until, you know, everyone's got their phone, everyone's got their LCD TV. And but for me, I think what was the reason I talk about, you know, all factuality is already theory, or the phenomena of the theory themselves, is when LCDs were, as screens were coming into being, the way in which they were sold was very much through environmental imagery. So in a sense, they were about themselves. So you get it less now, but when they were first being sold 10, 15 years ago, it was always running water, mountains, snow scenes, and flowing scenes. And the reason they did that was technological, because the capacity of the liquid crystal TV compared to the cathode ray TV is you get smooth movement without any aftertrace, and you can stop it, you can freeze it. And you used to have it on the Sony. They don't do it anymore. It had a button freeze because you could just capture a single beautiful image and there'd be no trace, you know. So it literally gave you a flowing liquidity and the capacity to freeze it, which is, you know, technologically enabled by the liquid crystals and the way they turn on and off the pixels and make these things possible. At the same time, the first sort of big films that were being made around that time were things like The Day After Tomorrow, which again was really literally about freeze ups and tsunamis and a sort of Hollywood's version of an environmental crisis, which revolves around global warming, the new ice age, freezing and melting. And so I sort of see these principles, these qualities kind of coursing through capitalist culture kind of from start to end, and began to see Caspar David Friedrich's Sea of Ice, which if you see it in a Hamburg gallery is the size of the first LCD TVs, and it looked just like an image from a Hollywood movie that happens 90 years later. So they're sort of speaking to each other through that time about the fundamental energies of capitalism, I think, which then work back into our conceptualization, which then also works back into our models of technology and our models of science. So yeah, and so then the challenge is to think, well, is that kind of done in a way? And certainly for me, I mean, the reason I sort of started to turn my attention to is more diffuse kind of forms, I think, is in recognition or in wanting to make the claim that there's certain kinds that we are in a new stage. We're not beyond that sort of liquid crystal stage, but it's mutated into something that's more to do with these and it's tied up with environmental thinking and so on, but with these pervading elements and these fuzzy elements and these distributed elements and something about particles in their various ways. So that's kind of the shift. And and in some ways some of that language I could make that case, Samsung QLED TVs, they want us to think that we're working at the quantum and that every single pixel, on the screen is independent of every other one. And this is about, kind of a much more particulated notion of things rather than a liquid crystal notion of things. But, that's also just marketing too, but nothing is just marketing. I mean, these are the frames we're asked to think through. Thank you for the Flusser quote. That's really good. Are we going to be able to hold on to this stuff? Maybe you see. Do you know? Does the chat all get recorded for the archive as well?
Yes, I think so. And I can also do a recording. I can also save the chat for an individual file as well.
Brilliant, thank you. It'd be really helpful.
No problem, anytime.
To look at that. That would be really good. Yeah. Anyone else?
I had a question or comment on the use or abuse maybe of metaphors in 19th century natural sciences, which you alluded to at the beginning, which I think becomes elevated through theories of complexity and self-organization that you also mentioned, right? Organic species imitating or mimicking, non-organic life forms, sedimentation, these processes that kind of become articulate in the late 20th century through complexity science and stuff like that. But I'm wondering, particularly with regards to a naturalism, like how far does this spiral go? Like, is there any way in which, we can think or be unable to think through this analogy or taxonomy? Like when do these metaphors not communicate? Like when are they ineffective? Or maybe this is kind of the point of this course, is to kind of point to this fogginess or haziness surrounding our current episode, where things are a little more, opaque than transparent against these silicon promises of, big tech and so on. So, yeah, I mean, those are just kind of a weird, a set of questions.
That's a good comment. I mean, please just say something more about like the 19th, how you think it works, like the earlier kind of phase of that.
I mean, just thinking, maybe this belabored, Schelling's whirlpool example, thinking about dynamism, but like kind of giving these lively animated properties to just events in nature, right? And then think about like evolution as a earthly process, and not necessarily just like a species bound process. And we've got different time scales that kind of invoke deeper temporality. But at the same time, I think we can keep on going down this rabbit hole. But I'm interested in the moments when these things don't communicate, right? And there's maybe a syntax error or a fog, right? Or something that is elusive to capital K knowledge, right? Or rationality or science. So, to think about this naturalist project around the Enlightenment as something that is, a countercurrent to full taxonomy or like full, metaphor.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I think we will probe that more, because I was suddenly reminded as you were speaking about Schelling and the whirlwind of the Bachelard, and another Bachelard text that I didn't set, but the 1930s one. There's two: the intuition of the instant, and then another one, I think it is, where he writes about atomism and dust, and he's talking about Descartes. We wouldn't have this sort of developed theory of atomism if Descartes hadn't lived in the countryside near a really dusty road and watched the carriages go by and the dust whirl up, or sit as a hermit in his cottage and watch the dust dancing in the sunlight. And these are experiences of the world and movement that then sort of transfer into atomistic thinking, and then later into the sort of the perspective of the atom, and and it all comes from this kind of perceiving a whirlwind of dust kicked up by horses' legs, and kind of in internalizing that somehow, and that becomes useful, or it becomes a mechanism through which natural history starts to be explained, and then science on the basis of it. And I guess that's what interests me about liquid crystal, because that whole idea of the crystal and then the liquid crystal actually being a life form, and this feeds into arguments between mechanists and vitalists, but what is life, and elan vital, and so there are arguments, aren't there? But it just happens that some of these metaphors kind of work enough to propel something to another stage. And so Otto Lehmann, who identifies and names the liquid crystal, he writes endless books and makes an animation about apparent life. I mean, he calls it apparent life rather than life, but it meets the conditions for life, and that all eventually enables somehow the liquid crystal TV to come into being in a highly not as a life form at all, but a kind of screen for life. But when do these not work? And I'm sure there's always tension within them, and there's a danger within turbid media and within the ones I've chosen, as I've sort of suggested with the cloud, that they just become themselves too baggy and too capacious, and that they can come to mean anything, which means they mean nothing, and there's no steer within them. And I suppose it just is a response to just how incredibly effective the digital cloud metaphor was, and continues to be in terms of our imagination of things, and what we know, but we also sort of don't know what the basis of the cloud is, and then what that makes possible or necessary in terms of our behaviors is so immense. Would one need to feed a different kind of metaphor in order to activate politically against it, you know, not one that can be turned into cute plushes that you could buy on Amazon. You know, would it make a difference? Or, you know, maybe it wouldn't, maybe it doesn't matter anyway. But yeah, but I think that's a good point, something we need to think about more, and be really happy if you wanted to talk more about that at some point. Anyone else? What might be good, I mean, so I'm still finding my way around these structures, but I think we have do we have like a Discord? And are we all connected on the WhatsApp, or is that just presenters?
It's only presenters on the WhatsApp,
Okay.
but yeah, I'm pretty sure we will have a Discord group for the seminar.
Okay, because you know it's difficult because of the copyright constrictions and so on. It's difficult to you know, show stuff within class, I think. But it might be really good also to just exchange through Discord, maybe things that we could watch individually, like, you know, films or other material, music or whatever, which could also just you know, feed into these discussions, because I think it would also be good to yeah, think about some of the more, you know, representational media and how that works with some of these ideas as well. And that would be a mechanism for doing that. So well, there's also the Google Classroom, isn't there, where I think there's probably a message function within there. So, you know, anybody wants to point us towards particular things we could all watch and talk about, it would be really useful. Anyone? 10 Skies. Okay, so everyone see that? James Benning's 10 Skies might be a good accompaniment to this week's reading. Is that George? If George wanted to say a word about that, that would be really welcome.
Hi.
Hi.
It's not a question, but I'm just reminded by a series of sculptures done by a renowned Filipino artist named David Medalla called Cloud Canyons.
Right.
It's basically a structure with oozing foam in a glass substrate, which also elicits the idea of a kind of evanescent, frothy sculpture. And there's also an anecdote that in the Paris of 1960s, Gaston Bachelard introduced one of Medalla's performances to the Academy of Raymond Duncan, and subsequently Medalla was also he also became part of Documenta 5, which was curated by Harold Jean in the 1970s. I just think there's interesting art historical conjunctions in these.
Brilliant.
Let's say an image in the chat.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, that would be really nice to look at. Yeah, there's an exhibition currently in London I want to see, which is somehow seems to be about picking up dust as well. Let's see what that is. But yeah, David Medalla, that would be fantastic to take a further look at that. Yeah, Ishan Adams, Kicking Dust. I'm going to try and see if I can see that this week, because it's really hard to do anything in London at the moment because you have to book in advance and there are very few places. But this is a South African artist who's using dance and dust in some sort of way. But yeah, Medalla, what would be okay? You've sent a link to take. Brilliant. I wonder if they've got any of those on display. Wow. Cloud canyons. Nice. Excellent. I mean, there's been some really strange stuff of, you know, that sort of quest. I mean, one of the reasons why Nikaya father fascinates me and his making of the artificial snowflake is, you know, it's so incredibly hard to do. And I think that the making of fog is something much much easier, but it's clouds are another kind of form, you know, where artists have put a fair amount of effort into trying to produce like the artificial cloud, or to, you know, and of course there's a whole history, isn't there, of operationalizing weather and uh, um, you know, producing good weather for political events or sporting events, and that whole manipulation is quite an interesting aspect as well. And I think for the bubbles and that production of foam in Medalla, I think is interesting. Reminds me sort of a little bit around the same time as forgotten his name. Oh, Mud Muses. I've forgotten who did that. Anyway, whoever made Mud Muses, this sort of production of bubbles in this kind of tank of mud, like a primal kind of soup of stuff, which would be an interesting sort of counterpart to Medalla, with what looks like this sort of beautifully frothy, airy white substance, and then this sort of primal bubbling mud that makes extraordinary bodily kind of sounds as it produces. Any more thoughts? Just look ahead to next week and just check that we all know what we're doing. Yeah, so second session then, I presume we're moving on to Froth. And I mean, I haven't written anything yet, so if there's any, you know, anything you want me to cover or ways of doing things. Okay, we're looking at ether, and we're looking a little bit more at the idea of the non-fungible token. I put down something by Geraldine Juarez, really interesting artist, Mexican artist who lives in Stockholm and Berlin, which I just came across just as I was putting this together. She's really angry and worked up about the whole NFT, non-fungible tokens and art. So I thought it would be worth looking at that, and then some reading around Lodge and Ether. But we're also going to take it into questions of froth more broadly, space froth, and maybe we could look some more at Medalla for that, various other things. So if you come across any frothy aspects, either share them beforehand or show them on the day. If anyone wants to do a little presentation about that, just, you know, contact me either through Google Classroom or through the Discord, or directly by email, and we can factor that in. But if there's no more comments or questions or points,
would like to make a quick comment on
Yeah,
clouds. Not actually a question, just something that came to my mind as we were talking. And I just remembered of what is being called the air rivers that flow through the Amazon rainforest. Don't know if it's a recent study that's been published, that it's been kind of proved that the rainforest creates a river of clouds over it that carries the water from the ocean to the insides of the continent. And that water, when it rains on the middle of the continent, it creates what we have as the Cerrado, the Brazilian Cerrado, that is the most biodiverse savanna in the whole world. And there are many, and the Cerrado is what creates, not what creates, this whole water that comes from the Amazon rainforest in these rivers is what adds water to the water aquifer in the whole continent. So the whole water we have from here comes from there, and it is this constant interchange. And there is also another studies that complement these ones that shows that there's actually a dust cloud from the Sahara Desert that comes from that crosses the whole Atlantic Ocean and actually brings the sun to the Amazonian rainforest, and that's where the minerals from the whole forest come from. Really, I'm serious. I can look for it and then share on the Discord. This is kind of recent.
Wow.
And it's like a lot of clouds, a dust cloud that becomes a water cloud. Yes, and it gives and that kind of, this is really the basis of the biggest biodiversity spot we have. I mean, that's really something interesting. It's kind of taking the sand from the desert and creating the most biodiversity we can, interchanging the forms and creating this. I mean, it's just something it came to my mind. I've been working with this for some time, so I couldn't stop relating.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. No, it'd be really nice to have a link to look at that further.
I'll look for the English link to send you.
Yeah. Is it being disrupted though? I mean, with changes, I don't know, is climate change occurring in any way in relation to it?
The deforestation from in the Amazon rainforest been creating some disruption on this water cycle. So we are having a lot of water problems in here in the south of the south. That is where the water ends up. This is the end of this whole water cycle.
Right. Yeah. So
like São Paulo is without water because of that. Uruguay is kind of without water because of that. So the Prata aquifer is without water because of that.
Wow.
It's complete into the changing of those things.
But this is being recognized now or understood, at least.
Yes, it is. It's because there's research on the air rivers. I think that's how they call it in English. Okay. It's been published in like 2 or 3 years ago, something like that. Okay. It's been a 20-year research to be able to prove that. Right. And there's a beautiful image of those clouds making through the forest. They have actually built the highest tower in Latin America for making this research. It's the biggest construction was made to track these clouds.
Wow, that's amazing. Funny, it feels like the other end of something that, for me, I was fascinated by Kant's meteorology, and he names winds, these natural winds that move, in a certain part of the southern hemisphere, the trade winds, because they're the ones that blow, the European ships along so that they can do their colonial business. And it's this sort of, seeing nature as there for the sort of benefit of human commerce somehow. So this is like I like this as a sort of antidote to this. This is this sort of natural system that, of course, humans benefit from, but it's you know, it's its own thing. And so to call it an air river is a sort of very beautiful way of, you know, giving it its sort of natural form rather than calling it, you know, like a trade.
It's funny that you mentioned the human part in it, but because there's also another studies that show that the Amazon rainforest has been kind of planted by paleo indigenous throughout the years. So we can think of all of that as a constant interchange of that. Yeah. So they brought the water inside of the continent. Right. And, you know, throughout thousands and thousands of years, but it's been through their way of living that this been made. And there is something that they've been calling it's like black earth, something like that. That's what gives the fertility to the forest. And it's been produced by their way of living.
Yeah. But it was also fascinating what you said about the minerality, like all of that diverse minerality also being.
The minerals are the ones that come from Sahara Desert. That's the intertwining of things.
Wild. Great. Well, thank you. Yeah, anyone else? Oh, we've got a comment from Pedro. Okay, Brazilian artist Laura Vinci makes cloudscapes as weather sculptures. Great, another thing to follow up. That's really exciting. Ooh. Brilliant. Okay, well, I hope, yeah, everyone's in a position to follow some of these things up. Other things we can exchange over the week, and yeah, let me know if you want to present or if you want us to watch anything in advance. And otherwise, I think shall we draw to a close now and enjoy the rest of your weekend. You've got more of it than me. I'm already 4:30 in the afternoon. So yeah, thanks so much for coming along. And,
thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you. See you soon. Bye.
Thank you a lot. Bye bye.
Thank you.